Hello YouTube and welcome to a slightly different episode of Raw History. This week we'll be discussing an issue very dear to my heart, the history of my people and the struggles that we have persevered. From ancient times, my ancestors struggled to find a place in this world. We were worshipped by some yet outcast by others. If we look back far enough, we may even uncover the origins of this proud and noble race and get an insight into what the future holds for my brothers and sisters around the globe. YouTube, come with me and we will discover the long and magnificent history of the Gingers. It's going to be fun.
We don't need no education.
So despite ginger being the rarest natural hair colour in both humans and in animals, gingers have been a pretty significant force throughout most of human history. Elizabeth I was a ginger. Cleopatra was a ginger, Christopher Columbus was a ginger, General Custer was a ginger, Thomas Jefferson, Van Gogh, Mark Twain, Galileo, Florence Nightingale, Napoleon, and Judas Iscariot were also all gingers. Well, maybe. So I know not all of those gingers were the most morally upstanding historical figures, but still, that's a hefty amount of history influenced by redheads. Now, for the sake of keeping things fair and not just turning this video into a ginger pride rant, I should probably point out that with some of the older figures, we don't know that they were ginger. Like, for example, we have no photos of Cleopatra, so we have to go on what other people said about her, and some of them said she was ginger, and some of them said she wasn't. Similarly with Judas, he's often painted as being a redhead, but at the time that most of these paintings were made, ginger hair was associated with undesirables, and in the Renaissance that meant Jews. And so these paintings are probably more anti-Semitic than they are pro-ginger, unfortunately. However, to truly get to the bottom of the ginger question, we have to go back further to look at the very first ginger humans to ever walk on planet Earth. Recent evidence published in a 2007 edition of the Science Journal revealed that many Neanderthals also had ginger hair and fair complexions. Now, it would be really cool if I could say that gingers are descended from Neanderthals and we're like a whole different species from the rest of humanity, but that's not true. If you remember way back in episode 2, I think it was, when we were talking about anatomically modern humans, well, Neanderthals are not anatomically modern humans, and the mutation that causes their red hair is very different from the mutation that causes ours, and so we probably didn't get it from them. However, for the Neanderthals with red hair and fair complexions, this was an evolutionary advantage in the frozen northern areas of Europe where there was less sunlight, and so the same was probably true for the early ginger humans. Gingers are more efficient than anyone else at making vitamin D, which we mostly get from the sun, and so we need less sunlight to function, which explains why I'm so disgustingly pale, but also I am evolutionarily superior, so suck it. According to geneticists, the first red-headed humans were living in the Arctic Circle about 20,000 years ago, which makes ginger hair the most recent of all the hair colours to evolve, as black hair and brown hair and even blonde hair had been around for an awful lot longer. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked with genetics, and this is a history show. So let's talk about the history of gingers and how they were treated by the mundane hair typicals throughout the ages. So let's start with the positives. In the Pacific and Polynesian cultures, red hair is seen as a sign of noble birth and a mark of leadership. In the mountains of northern New Zealand, there supposedly lived the Turehu people, who were thought to be a semi-mythical group of red-headed spirit people, and according to local legends, they were very hostile towards the Maori natives that lived in the lowlands. Now, although they're often described as being fairy-like, it is probable that there is some truth in the Turehu legends, as red hair and fairer skin can be found in full-blooded Maoris, and the gene predates Captain Cook's discovery of New Zealand. So the Maoris must have got their red hair from somewhere. Although, if we're being realistic, the bit about the Turehu being fairy spirit people is probably Maori propaganda and sadly not actual historical fact. However, elsewhere in New Zealand's indigenous culture, red hair is referred to as urekahu, and it is particularly common amongst the Maniapoto people and the Wanganui people of New Zealand's northern island. Throughout Polynesia, which is a very large chain of small islands far to the west of Australia in the Pacific Ocean, ginger hair was known by many different names in many different languages, but it was always seen as a sign of prestige. The major Maori god of the harvests, whose name was Rongo, is described as having hair that glowed as red as the sun, and on Easter Island, gingers were considered to be descended from the gods. So being a ginger in the Pacific is not too shabby. But unfortunately in Europe, things were not looking quite so good for my fiery-haired brethren. Really not that long ago, red hair was seen as a sign of being oversexed. Ha, cool! Yeah, but also being a criminal. Aww. Yeah, in fact, in the 1800s, an Italian scientist called Cesare Lombroso claimed that 48% of all criminals were redheads. Although actually, in Cesare Lombroso's defense, the famous pirate of the Caribbean, Anne Bonny, well, she was ginger, and another famous pirate, Barbarossa, or Redbeard, he had a red beard. The biblical antihero Lilith, she was a redhead. The notorious Wild West murderer Wild Bill, he had a giant golden mane. The American axe murderess Lizzie Borden, she had flaming locks of auburn hair. The maniacally evil Donald Trump, well, he has terrible hair, but it was at one point ginger. And in fact, there's even a group of Sherlock Holmes villains who banded together and called themselves the Red-Headed League. So, actually, there may be a little bit of truth in that ginger desperado idea. Also, Hitler banned the marriage of gingers as he was afraid of their deviant offspring, although, actually, let's be honest, Hitler's opinion doesn't really count for crap, does it? Looking back even further in Europe, red hair was often seen as a sign of devil worship or witchcraft in medieval Christian times, and being ginger was often considered enough evidence to convict someone of being a witch on both sides of the Atlantic. If we look back even further to the days of King Alfred the Great, we'll find a collection of Middle English sayings called the Proverbs of Alfred, which were supposedly spoken by the king himself. These proverbs include little gems like, "The red man, he is quite wicked, for he will give you evil counsel," which basically means don't trust your ginger-haired friends or else they will betray you. So I already mentioned Judas, like a little way back at the beginning of the video, and he is probably the most famous example of a ginger guy betraying his BFF. But this is where medieval Christians go into a really weird territory with their gingerphobia. Now, as we all know, gingers are basically vampires. We can't go out in the sunlight and we'll steal your soul. But did you know that gingers are literally vampires? And I don't mean literally and figuratively, no, I mean they are actually literally vampires. Well, that is, at least according to medieval scientists, and I'm using the term medieval scientist very loosely here. But yeah, forget Dracula or Nosferatu. According to the early Catholic Church, Judas was the first vampire, and he became a creature of the night after he committed suicide over the guilt of his role in Jesus' death. Supposedly, the 40 pieces of silver that Judas had been paid for his betrayal fell to the ground after he died, and they became the only weapon that could ever harm a vampire. And that's why in a lot of the early legends it's a silver crucifix or a silver bullet that turns out to be the vampire's weakness. Now, I know that over the years the legend changed and it became werewolves that were susceptible to silver, but in the original 1897 Dracula by Bram Stoker, it wasn't Buffy the Vampire Slayer with a wooden stake through the heart, it was a silver bowie knife that did the Transylvanian count in. Thus, people with ginger hair in medieval Europe were often associated with either devil worshippers or Judas, and this wasn't helped by the general racism at the time and the belief that the only ginger people were either wild Scottish tribesmen or Eastern European Jews, and neither of these groups were treated particularly well by the ruling European elite. But this is so weird, because at the same time that the people of Europe are saying that redheads are in league with Satan, many of them were being ruled over by gingers. Richard the Lionheart, William Rufus, Henry II, Henry VIII, his daughter Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, Alexander II of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, both Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, the man who had him executed, Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia, Isabella I, Alexander the frickin' Great, maybe Cleopatra, Baldwin IV, Napoleon, Simon de Montfort, Boudicca, Anne Boleyn, Winston Churchill, King David, Queen Victoria, Lenin, Stalin's daughter, Trotsky, and Prince Harry are all European rulers or members of royalty with ginger hair. Which begs the question, if we're so bad, then why are we so awesome? And ginger leaders aren't just a European phenomenon either. Dwight Eisenhower, Calvin Coolidge, Ulysses S. Grant, Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, and, George Washington are all examples of American presidents, and although some were better than others, the one thing they have in common was their carrot top. So why are there so many ginger historical figures? It may just be because we stick out more and so we're more memorable. I mean, there were way more than 7 brown-haired US presidents, and I'm not making a video about them. But even so, there is a disproportionate number of great and powerful gingers that have contributed to history, especially considering we only make up like 1 or 2% of the world's population. Maybe it's because we steal so many souls. Or, I don't know, maybe we really are descended from spirit people as the Maoris believed. Or maybe it's just one of those great unexplainable coincidences of history, with no rhyme or reason to it. It's not clear. But one thing that is clear is we aren't going anywhere. For years, rumours have persisted that the ginger gene is going extinct, but this is a myth. And it's not even a myth that makes sense, unless every single ginger person in the world stopped having children, like right now. The ginger gene will continue going on strong for many a generation to come, so you can sleep easier knowing that in the future there will still be redheads. And I'm afraid that's it for this week, but please keep the discussion going in the comment section below, and if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more future Raw History videos. And I have a very topical head scratcher for this episode. Why do people call redheads carrot tops when a carrot's top is... well, it's green. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next week.